Hey all, hope all is well. This is another video in the Road to Grandmaster series. And this one, I'm going to go over my round one game from the 2019 Marshall Chess Club Championship. Now, the championship this year was a little bit different than in years past because typically the Marshall likes to have an open tournament for its championship, but this year they decided to make it a closed event. So the criteria for getting an invitation was that you actually were an active member of the club and or a strong titled player. And so this year the field was 10 players and everyone was at least of IM strength. So it was actually a very, very strong event. And because the average rating of the players were so strong, then the GM norm score is actually 6 out of 9, which is actually quite rare for norm events because typically the score is 6.5 out of 9. And that is normally the case when I play in Charlotte, for instance, which has been the premier destination for closed GMIM norm events. So this was actually a really huge opportunity for me, just because it was in New York, so there was no travel expenses, and because I actually got an invitation, it was a huge chance for me to kind of take a next step forward, and in my chess career, if you will, and try to kind of basically make some inroads against players that are going to be pretty strong. So in this one, in my round one game, I was actually paired against Grandmaster Irina Krush. And if you've been on the American chess scene at all, you know that Irina is kind of a household name because she became, I believe, one of the first American women to become a Grandmaster. I don't quote me on that, but I believe she's one of the few women that basically grew up in America, essentially, to become a GM, and she's been a real force at the U.S. Women's Championship for over a decade. I can recall her, when I was coming up as a junior player, winning year after year after year, so I'm sure she's won it probably about half a dozen times. And even though she's not as active a player as she once was, she's still a very tough out and, a very good player. So without further ado, let me get into the game. So I was white in this one, and I wasn't sure how to really attack Irina, but I decided to play the move d4, which is the typical starting move for me. And then after d4, Irina played d5. And this was a little bit of a surprise to me because I thought she might go for a Nimzo Indian or even a King's Indian or Grunfeld. She seemed to play a lot of different openings. But d5 at least signaled to me that she was not trying to play the most dynamic stuff. And I decided to play knight f3 because I still wasn't quite sure what she was going to do. And I kind of wanted to sort of tease out a particular, path or intention with her second move. So now she played the move knight f6, and I still wasn't quite sure what her intention was because, from this type of structure, she can opt for c6 or she can opt for e6, and it's really just quite unclear for me what she was going to be trying to do. So I went for e3 again, just kind of waiting, basically not committing to, a really concrete structure without Irina telling me whether she's going to be a Slav player or a Queen's Gambit decline player. Because typically, again, this e6 move would be Queen's Gambit declined. The c6 move would be Slav. But e3 is a very modest move. I've definitely used it before in 2019, particularly in the beginning of the year. And, a lot of times people might just kind of wait and play, e6 and b6, and that was actually a pretty decent remedy that a lot of people used against me early in the year. I wasn't so sure if Irina had seen my games, though, and I thought this might be a good, e3 might be a good way to kind of challenge her and make her make a concrete decision. And she decided to make a very principled decision because here she played the move c5. And c5 is really the most aggressive move I think you can play against the e3 setup because you're basically saying that since white isn't trying to take the center with the move c4, which is so typical in queen's pawn openings, black's going to try and, basically play a little bit of role reversal and take the space in the center instead. And now it is almost like I'm playing an opening reversed, a tempo up. And I had some ideas about structures where I was playing the black side a tempo up, so I wasn't so distraught by this development. And I played the very strange looking move a3. And a3 is a little bit of a specialty that I'd cooked up a little bit earlier in the year. It didn't really have a chance to play. If you can recall, at least I think it was the New York International in the summer of 2019, I played a game against Robert Perez in the e6, d5, a6 line of the Queen's Gambit declined. And basically this is a similar type of deal because I'm basically threatening in a lot of lines to play d takes c5. And the nice thing about this a3 move is that I'm actually playing to reinforce a c5 pawn with b4. So a3 is actually threatening to take on c5, and black has to be kind of concrete about what they're going to do here. Irina decided to take on d4, and this is definitely a very reasonable option. And after e takes d4, we have this structure that I actually have a lot of experience in, which is the Carlsbad. And the Carlsbad structure is characterized by black having this king-side pawn majority and black having a queen-side majority. And basically, there are a lot of dynamics here that exist in the position. Typically, white has a little bit more space on the king side because of the pawn, because of the space. Essentially, he has a lot of play on the e file in particular, whereas black, on the other hand, tries to get an initiative going on the queen side based upon the minority attack with an eventual a6 and b5. And it's a little bit counterintuitive because you might say, well, why is it that black is playing on the queen side when they have less pawns there, and white is playing on the king side where there are less pawns there? And the reason for this is really because of a question of where the half-open files are. And so the half-open file for black is on the C line, and the half-open file for white is on the E line. And so that kind of informs where each side's respective play is going to come from. So anyways, after e takes d4, black played knight c6, and I played the move bishop d3. Note that this move a3 is a little bit useful because now the square is covered, so knight b4 can't harass that bishop, and is another reason why a3 is a nice move to have. And now black played bishop g4, which is a very standard Queen's Gambit exchange variation move where you pin this knight and you cause some unpleasantness to white's structure. I now played the move c3 just to reinforce my d4 pawn, and black now went e6, and I played h3, basically just essentially giving my king an escape square later on in the game after I castle, and essentially just forcing the bishop back to h5. One of the things I like about this is that by playing h3 now and the bishop going to h5, which it wound up doing, there are a lot of positions now where I'm going to have the option of playing bishop takes g6 once the bishop actually arrives on that square. And it's my opinion that the structure with h takes g6 is actually kind of favorable for white. Now, it's a little bit tricky to explain why this is the case, but I'm going to try to do so. Because you might say, well, isn't that structure really solid with, basically the pawn on g6, pawn on g7, and then these pawns? Well, the reason I think it's not as great as it looks is because once you have this pawn on g6, I have this lever with h4, h5 later in the game to kind of undermine the structure and potentially even open the h-file. And that type of lever I wouldn't necessarily have if the pawn was still in h7. The other thing about the structure with bishop takes g6 and h takes g6 is as solid as it looks, it's actually quite immobile. And there's certain circumstances where a knight can come to g5, and maybe there's even some ideas of mate on the h-file because of basically the half-open h-file and the pawn not being on h7. And in general, with the knight on g5, at some point, the structure is actually not particularly mobile because you can't push the f pawn because the e6 pawn is hanging, and because of that, I sometimes can just park a piece on g5 and keep it there. So that's basically why I play this h3 move, because I kind of welcome the exchange on g6, but it's a little bit nuanced, and it's not. It's okay if you don't quite understand it. It's actually quite a complicated concept. And people might disagree on that, by the way, as well. But if you want to actually see a game that I thought was extremely instrumental with the structure with h takes g6, recently, actually, take a look at I think it was the World Blitz Championship. There's a game between Magnus Carlsen with white and Vladimir Kramnik with black in the London system. Vladimir Kramnik came out of retirement to play the World Blitz Championship, so he's still retired, but he just wanted to play that event. And Carlsen beat him in textbook style, just grinding him out, but it all revolved around the structure that occurred after h takes g6, and I think it's extremely instructive how Carlsen broke down Kramnik's position. Anyways, after bishop h5, I now castled, and black played queen c7. A little bit of a Freudian slip saying white played queen c7 because in so many of these lines, the colors reversed. The queen goes to c2, the bishop goes to d6, and you could see that the roles have basically reversed, where black is playing white and I'm essentially playing black just with a tempo up. So that's why I was saying, white is doing this thing, but it's really black that's doing it. Anyways, after queen c7, I went bishop e3, and this is actually very much in the vein of the development in the system with the e6, a6 line of the Queen's Gambit decline that turns into the exchange variation, because typically in the setups with the Queen's Gambit exchange, the bishop stays on c1 for a while, and the light-squared bishop goes to e2 just to deal with this pin. But the point with having the pawn on a3 is that I'm actually going to put my bishop on d3 to be on a more active square, eyeing the king. And I put the bishop on e3, and then only after put the knight on d2. And essentially, I don't have any pieces that are not, actually doing a decent job. So, in my opinion, this is a little bit more of an active setup in the Queen's Gambit exchange variation than what is typical, but it's actually quite decent. So anyways, after bishop e3, bishop d6 was played. Makes a lot of sense. Just like in bishop d3 in the Queen's Gambit exchange for white, bishop d6 is the same type of idea. And I went knight bd2, reinforcing that knight on f3, now freeing up my queen to move so that I don't spoil my structure. And after castles, I play the move rook e1. And rook e1 might seem like a strange move because my bishop is in the way, and, it doesn't seem like there isn't much going on the e-file just yet. But it's a nice little prophylactic move because there are some positions where I will wind up flicking in knight e5 if my queen moves away, and it begins the fight for the central squares e5 and e4. So typically the square e5 is the real highway through which, essentially I could get my counterplay on the king side. And so by putting the rook on this half-open file, I might get a chance to do that later. Anyways, after rook e1, black played rook a b8, and this is also very textbook because now Irina is essentially trying to get this minority attack off. And the point is you play b5, you try to play b4, and then you try to chip away at this structure. And in a dream scenario, black would be really happy if the A and B pawns were traded and I was saddled with a structure with just the pawn on c3 and the pawn on d4, because the c3 pawn would be backward and weak, and if the c3 pawn drops, then the d4 pawn would also be a target. So that's kind of the dream positional scenario for black in the structure, is to try and chip away at my pawns. I now played the move queen b1, which is a little bit of a strange looking move, but it has an idea behind it. And the idea is actually to eye the h7 pawn. So the point is that now in certain structures, I'm actually trying to play the move knight g5. And the point is that by attacking the h7 pawn, I actually cause some consternation to the bishop on h5. So for example, let's say black played a move like b5. Now if I go knight g5 and black plays the move h6, well, after I move my knight back or even play knight h7, essentially black's going to have a problem where this bishop can't just drop back to g6 because it will be hanging. So just to illustrate, if I play knight h7 here, and then there's a capture, and then king h8, now after the move g4, actually this bishop is actually just more or less trapped, and if you go bishop g6, I wind up winning a pawn. So the point is to actually provoke h6 so that the bishop can drop to back to g6 cleanly. And it's kind of a nice idea, if I might say so myself. So with queen b1, because of this knight g5 idea, Irina decided to play bishop g6 right away, and I think this is actually a good choice. But now after bishop takes g6 and h takes g6, I get this structure, this pawn structure I was talking about, that I think is not without venom for white. I think there are some ideas now where I can kind of put a knight on g5 in some circumstances, or even kind of slowly build up for a h5 break. Now, the issue is I would love to play g3, king g2, and actually get that going, but g3 is actually out of the question because of bishop takes g3, and all of a sudden, the queen is converging. Black's getting at least 3 pawns for the piece, and I just don't even think this is really playable because, it's just a little bit too dangerous in my opinion to allow this. Black can always flick in the knight to g4. There might just be a perpetual with queen g4 check. And, maybe there isn't. Maybe I can actually dart away with king f2. But I just felt intuitively that, allowing or inviting this bishop takes g3 is probably not the best idea, even though maybe it's not the end of the world for me. I just didn't want to allow that. The other thing that I have to be a little bit wary of is, I'm trying to play this g3 h4 idea, but a lot of lines there's knight g4, which actually will attack the bishop on e3 and also give more strength to the bishop takes g3, queen takes g3 concept. So I just thought it's a little bit risky to play this g3 move. So instead of initiating my own kingside play, which is really what I wanted to do, I decided to play the move a4, which was a little bit of prophylaxis aimed at trying to slow down Black's minority attack with b5. After a4, Black played the move a6, and this is very natural, essentially trying to play b5 anyway. But the benefit of playing a4 and you basically forcing the trade of a pawns while Black tries to play b5 is that my rook gets an open file after the exchange of the a pawns. So this is one of the ways you can try and get some counterplay in the minority attack comes your way, is you actually trade the a pawns and you get that open file. And in some lines, you actually fix the pawn on b5 by playing b4. And that can be a real positional strength for white. So just to illustrate that, Black played the move. I played the move queen d3, and let's say Black played b5. Black did not. Black played rook f8. But let's say b5 was played. Now, after a takes b5 and a takes b5, there's the very, very positionally appealing b4. And it's kind of counterintuitive because you might say, aren't you giving yourself a backward c pawn, and all your pawns are fixed on dark squares, which could be a target for the dark square bishop in the endgame, and isn't this bishop on e3 quite lousy? But the point is that with this b4 move, I fixed the b5 pawn as a target, and I'm actually able to cover my backward c pawn by maneuvering this knight to c5. And on c5, all of a sudden my knight is a monster, and if you trade it, I actually have a protected passed pawn. So, for instance, let's say rook f8 is played now. Now after knight b3, let's say knight e7 and knight c5, white actually has a really, really great position because a scenario like this, basically gives white a protected passed pawn, and the b5 pawn might be a target at some point. And in my opinion, white's actually better. So, really, just positionally speaking, it's always, positionally desirable for white to take on b5 and then play b4 if the knight can very quickly come over and cover the backward c pawn. And this is something you see time and time again in these minority attack type of positions. So that's one of the strategic concepts. Now, Irina played the move rook f8, and this is a very, very accurate and precise move, and it's geared against rushing this b5 maneuver. Instead, you want to be a little bit more methodical, and the way you do that is you actually bring this knight over to c4 before you even consider playing b5. And the point is, by playing the knight to c4, you attack the b2 pawn, which is the base of my my Carlsbad pawn chain on the queen side, and yeah, you basically cause my structure. You basically tickle the queenside structure before playing b5, which is absolutely the right way you should handle this position. So Irina definitely had a classical chess education, and I'm not super surprised that she knew about this. So anyways, after rook fc8, I now played the move rook ec1, and part of the reason I played this move is because it's designed against this knight a5 idea that I was essentially talking about. Because now knight a5 was played anyway, and knight c4 is actually a very, very annoying move to contend with, because once the knight's on c4, not only does black have the option of taking on e3, taking that bishop, but also the b2 pawn is a target, and it's very, very annoying. And so now after knight a5, I played the move b3, and you can see now that this rook to c1 was actually hugely important, because if I, essentially didn't do that, I didn't have the option to play b3 because the c3 pawn would actually be hanging. Now, you could say that, my rook e1 move earlier in the game actually was not a very good one, because if we actually back up a few moves, I actually played rook e1 with the intent to play along the e-file, but instead, a few moves later, we see a scenario where all of a sudden I have to move my rook to c1. So an argument could be made that my rook e1 move was a little bit of a waste of time, especially if I was going to wind up playing b3 and rook c1 anyway. So maybe I could have gotten a slightly better version of this position without playing rook e1, but it is what it is. Many players, by the way, are not very keen on how to actually play, how to actually execute the minority attack properly, and so rook e1, usually wouldn't really be punished. But here, I think Irina did a good job. And by the way, my position is not, losing or even worse. It's really about equal. But I do have to be very, very careful here with my queenside pawns. Note that if I play a move like b4 now, this would be a huge mistake, because now the knight can come to c4, and the difference here, as opposed to the structures I showed you earlier with where the a-pawns were exchanged and black played b5, is that this knight is actually on a really, really active square, whereas in the previous lines it was on c6, and it didn't have the activity that it had before. The other thing is that this knight on d2 is not actually going to get a chance to go to c5 and dominate, because if I go knight b3, black always has the option of just going b6 and actually controlling that square now with his pawn, or with her pawn. So that's actually the key thing, and that's why you don't rush playing b5, because then the square can never be controlled by a pawn again, and here it actually can. So you can see both of us are actually very careful to essentially push our b-pawns just so we don't cede the c4 and c5 squares respectively. So hope that's kind of instructive. I think it's a very, very important nuance in the Carlsbad structure. So anyways, after b3, Irina now played b5. It makes sense now to play b5 because my knight now can't scurry over to c5 like in some of the previous lines with my pawn on b3. And after b5, I now took on b5 and played a takes b5. And we have a position where, black has made a lot of headway on the queen side, and I haven't really made headway on the king side. So I think even though the position is about equal, it's probably a little bit easier to play for black because I haven't made any inroads on the king side. I would have loved to play, this, break through this h4, h5 stuff, but I just did not get it off the ground. That being said, though, I do have an open a file for my rook, and I am kind of holding the fort nicely. So I'm not in any terrible shape. It's just a tricky position to defend. I have to be very, very careful because a move like b4 would really be a terrible move because then the knight can come to c4 with a dominant outpost. So I have to be a little bit smart and maneuver carefully. And I start with the move queen f1. And this move, if you haven't seen something like this before, might seem like just crazy, like totally nonsensical. But the idea is actually a very, very important one, and the concept is actually to, give this knight on f3 the opportunity to actually get to d3. In the Carlsbad structure, a knight on d3 in this type of position, or typically when black is playing it, a knight on d6 actually is a wonderful, wonderful square. The reason for it is from d3, I can actually control the c5 square. So my knight can maybe jump in there. I control the b4 square, which is where the minority attack break often happens. I also entertain the jumping into the e5 square, which I said was the highway through which my kingside initiative can really start. And even some lines covering the f4 square is valuable because sometimes there's some ideas where this square might be sensitive to because of pawn advances or even piece occupation. So essentially having that knight on d3 or on d6 if you're black is actually a really, really big deal. And so basically queen f1 clears the way for my knight to actually get to d3. Now, part of the reason I went queen f1 instead of what the computer actually recommends is queen e2, which is way more natural, is because I was still entertaining this idea of g3. I would really love to play g3 and king g2 and then eventually go in for h4. And I thought now with the queen f1, at least after g3, I might be able to just block with queen g2 in a lot of positions. And I'm not really worried about the sacrifice on taking on g3 if he only gets 2 pawns for it. The other reason is I thought in some lines maybe it might serve me well to actually be, in connection with my rooks here, and on e2 it wasn't really doing that. So that was why I went queen f1 versus queen e2, but the idea is similar, which is to try and get that knight to d3. So after queen f1, black played the move queen d8. And this is a reasonable move. Now, getting the queen off of the line of the c-file and potentially trying to build up pressure there, either by doubling the rooks or, just kind of waiting. And there's nothing wrong with this move. And after queen d8, I played the move bishop g5. Now, bishop g5 is a pin, but it's not one that should cause any real panic to black because essentially, even if the queen moves away from d8, it's unclear whether bishop takes f6, g takes f6 is a really desirable exchange because essentially I'd be giving up a bishop for a knight. And believe it or not, the pawn, if it gets to f6, is actually quite decent because it controls my hopping squares for the knight on e5 and g5. So I'm not even really thinking about taking on f6 necessarily. It's just kind of, making black a little bit less mobile and also preventing a potential knight e4 idea for now, which could be a little bit annoying in some positions. After bishop g5, black played the move b4. And now the position really kind of heats up because b4 really tries to initiate proceedings on the queen side and, basically cause some weakness in my structure. Now, black could have waited and, not really done anything, maybe gone bishop e7 or queen c7 back or something like that. But it's not really in the spirit of the position. The spirit is to try and get the minority attack and create some long-term weaknesses that are difficult to deal with. And b4 really does kind of force my hand because taking on b4 is pretty much out of the question. If I play, take on b4 after rook c1, rook takes c1, and let's say rook takes b4. Not bishop takes b4, rook takes b4. This is the type of position that, in my opinion, is significantly better for black. And the reason for that is I have 3 pawn islands, right? I have essentially 2 isolated pawns on b3 and d4, and black actually just has 1 pawn island. And so basically these pawns are going to be really, really difficult to defend and just not a pleasant position. And it's one where black can kind of press for a long, long time. So this is kind of the dream scenario of the minority attack, is that you create some pawn weaknesses that are just extremely unpleasant to defend and then squeeze in the long run. And that's kind of what I need to avoid. And so after b4, I pretty much need to keep my pawns together by playing the move c4. And what that does is that ensures that I at least have 2 pawn islands and not 3. But this move is also kind of double-edged because after d takes c4, which was played, in order to maintain my pawn structure, I have to play the move b takes c4. And all of a sudden, even though I have this nice pawn duo in the center, this b pawn is all of a sudden a passer. And it's very, very difficult to mobilize my pawns in the center, because if I consider playing the move c5, I cede the d5 square to black's pieces. And the d5 square would be a wonderful outpost for a knight, because it wouldn't be able to be challenged again by a pawn. So all of a sudden, after b takes c4, the position is extremely, extremely double-edged, because we each kind of have our own assets. And again, this b pawn can be difficult to deal with. Irina decided to play the move b3, which is absolutely fair and a good move. And obviously, you can see b2 is a serious threat. So I have to deal with that, and I did deal with that by playing the move rook cb1. And it was a tough decision to make, but I thought rook cb1 was a little bit better than rook ab1, because I thought I really ought to keep my rook on the open file. And I figured that rook cb1 keeps the rook on the open a file, and I thought that the half-open c file would be less important than the completely open a file. So that's why I decided to move the c rook. And after rook cb1, Irina played the move rook b4. Now, rook e4 is actually, in my opinion, a mistake. And but it makes a lot of sense that you play rook b4 just from the standpoint of challenging the c4 pawn a third time, and just kind of forcing me to play c5, or at least maybe that's what she thought she was doing. Fortunately, I have a really good response to rook b4 that I actually played, and because of that, she should have probably done something different. Instead of rook b4, bishop b4 would have been a lot stronger, and the reason for that is in a lot of lines you're still basically threatening the c4 pawn, because after bishop takes d2, if I recapture with the knight, the d4 pawn is actually hanging. So after bishop b4, I really have a tough decision to make about how to defend the c pawn because of that threat. And I would have to find the move bishop f4, which is not the easiest retreat in the world to make. It begins kind of a forcing sequence. Basically, I'm attacking this rook on b8, and after bishop takes d2, bishop takes b8, and b2, you have a little bit of a mess on the board that the computer actually says fizzles out after these moves that I'm showing, where eventually you get some type of kind of nebulous looking equality, where my pawn structure is a little bit worse, you can argue, than black's, because I have an isolated pawn and black doesn't. Although this e6 pawn is almost like a backward pawn, and the g6 pawn might be a target as well. So because of that, the position is pretty much close to equal. But bishop b4 is actually a tough move that would have had me have to play very, very precisely to equalize. Instead, after rook b4, I had this move knight e5, and this move is, I think, kind of difficult to see from far away, because it doesn't seem like it makes a lot of sense, because the bishop seemingly can just recapture. But the point is that you can't actually really do that, because I have this pin on f6, and all of a sudden the bishop on g5 is actually doing something useful, because I was saying that even if the queen moved away, it was really no big deal. I wasn't really threatening to take on f6. But now it's a little bit annoying. This knight on e5 effectively defends c4, and I actually give myself the option of still transferring the knight to d3, which was really the plan all along. So all of a sudden, I think I'm pretty much okay. After knight e5, black still had an opportunity to try and put a little bit more pressure on me, and this would have best been done with the move bishop c7. The point is that now that my knight has left the f3 square, d4 again is a target, and it's really, really tough to figure out how to defend it. But knight d3 is actually the best move, actually not defending it. And the point is that after rook b8, I actually go bishop e3 now. And the point is that now that the rook was actually forced back, I can play this move, defend the d4 pawn, and I don't have to worry about c4 just yet. And my pieces actually are, quite ideally placed, if I may say so, because my pawns are well protected, my knights are centralized, and this b pawn is not really a factor yet. It can't really advance much further, and might be a weakness more than a strength. But this would have been, the most pressing way to kind of force me to, react to the pawns. Another way, even more directly, instead of bishop c7 to kind of play, was the move b2. And the point is that after rook a2, which is more or less forced, then you could play bishop takes e5, and after d takes e5, actually play knight takes c4 and give up a piece. And the point is that after this exchange on c4 and this capture on f6, even though black is a piece down, essentially he has 2 pawns for the piece and a very, very dangerous pawn on b2. And because of that, the position is actually equal. Now, it's not like a dead position, and, both sides can kind of go wrong here. But, with a pawn on b2 being so strong and these rooks being split, it's really, really hard for white to make meaningful progress to try to win this game. And I think black actually could make quite a bit of progress playing like king g7 and g5 and, maybe encroaching a bit further with the queen, and really just eventually playing for this rook c1 idea. So I think this is a position that would have been very, very tricky to play for white, more so than black, even though it's equal and, both sides should be able to hold the draw here. Just a very, very interesting way to play that was an option. Instead, though, of either the move b2 or bishop c7, Irina played the move queen c7, and this move is actually clearly a mistake. And the reason for that is after the move knight d3, the rook is just forced back, and after rook b7, I now have the move rook a4. And this might have been a difficult move to see from afar, because it seems like the most natural way to defend the c-pawn would be to do so, vertically by just defending it from behind. But the point is I can't do that because of b2. And all of a sudden, after rook a4, I'm actually doing an excellent job of covering this pawn. And remarkably, even though the rook on a4 is unprotected, you can't actually challenge it because the knight on a5 is loose. So black would love to play a move like queen d7, but they can't do that because the knight's just hanging. And now I managed to have all my pieces pretty decently consolidated and can consider trying to round up the b3 pawn, which still has not really, played a role, or as prominent a role as you would have thought it would have played after Irina played b3. So after rook a4, Irina played the move knight c6, moving that knight away and attacking the d4 pawn. But this is actually kind of a strange-looking move, because after the simple bishop e3, which I wound up playing, I'm again managed to cover my pawns here, and now b3 is just actually hanging. And it's, quite difficult to defend it, because one of the more natural moves, rook cb8, which, tries to do that job, actually runs into c5. And the point is that if you back the bishop up, I have bishop f4, which is a really important skewer on the rook on b8. The other thing I can do, by the way, instead of even, trying to go for c5, because c5 is a little bit double-edged because I cede the d5 square to the knight. The other move I can play is also just queen d1 and just add a third attacker on that pawn. And again, you can't really, it's very difficult at least to try and defend this pawn again. You could go knight a5 back, but I'm probably going to go c5 then, and then picking up the exchange seems extremely attractive. And if you go b2, I can even play rook a2 and just, again, chase this pawn until it, is lost. And I can even converge on it again with queen c2. So all of a sudden, this b pawn that was, an asset is now kind of becoming a liability. And remarkably, my hanging pawns, which did seem kind of, that it seemed like it might be the bane of my existence about a few moves back, 3 or 4 moves back, all of a sudden is actually a very legitimate strength. So anyways, after bishop e3, black played the move rook b8, and I did play the move queen d1, and it's actually a pretty decent move, just challenging the b3 pawn. And now it's just very, very difficult to defend. Black played the move queen d7, but this doesn't really defend the b3 pawn, and I just played rook takes b3 because there were no real dangerous discoveries against my rook on a4, because my queen on d1 is indirectly defending the rook on a4. So if you play a move like knight takes d4, I just go rook takes b7, and I actually pick up the knight on the next move, and my rook is protected. So after rook takes b3, black actually took on b3, and after knight takes b3, all of a sudden I'm actually just a pawn up with a really, really nice position, because I have nice space advantage in the center. My rook is quite active on the a file, and my knights are quite reasonably placed, and just a really, really good transformation for me. Black now played the move knight e4, trying to cover the c5 square, because my next plan was to try and converge on c5 by playing knight bc5. And after knight e4, I played the move rook a1, which is actually by far the best move in the position, because now that I'm not, jumping with knight c4 or knight c5 or just moving that knight right away, it's important that I just move the rook out of the line of fire of that queen on d7. After rook a1, black played bishop c7. I think in some lines trying to tee up queen d6 and queen h2. Again, playing a move like g3 might be a touch risky because of some sacrifices. But bishop c7 is not so great, because you're actually kind of inviting this knight to come to c5. And I thought, well, I am a pawn up. Trades should be helpful. And so I played the move knight c5, just trying to get rid of this pesky e4 knight. And after knight takes e5 and knight takes e5, I thought I was very much in the driver's seat, because all of a sudden this move, black played queen e7, but this move queen d6, which you might say is, a little bit of an annoying move to deal with, can just be met with g3, and there are no sacrifices here, and I've covered the threats, and now I can consider playing knight a6 or knight e4 and challenging that queen next. So after knight c5, Irina played the move queen e7, and here was actually a very, very critical moment in the game, because I was a little bit down on time. I had a little bit more time than Irina, but I was trying to figure out at how to prosecute this advantage. And one of the things that was always annoying me is it seemed like if I move my bishop away, the d4 pawn would be a little bit of a target. And I was a little bit worried about rook d8, because after rook d8, there's annoying pressure on the d4 pawn, and there's some ideas with e5 or even bishop b6. And I just thought this construction with the knight on c5 and the pawn on d4 wouldn't last. And so I thought I maybe should do something quite concrete before rook d8 was actually played. So I played the move knight a6, trying to kind of force matters. Instead, the move rook a6 would have been way more effective. And the reason for this is I challenged this knight on c6, which was bothering me and attacking this pawn on d4. And if the knight moves and attacks my rook, I just play rook a4. And I kind of hold up black's counterplay with rook d8 and the knight on c6 attacking d4. And, it's just a good way to kind of, keep a little bit more attention in the position instead of trading all the pieces, which is basically what I tried to do. After rook a4, if the knight goes back, I now can play knight a6, and there's just a little bit of a difference here, because there's less pressure on the d4 pawn now, because I can always, play along the a file with rook a4 and queen a1 and kind of try to trade those rooks. So if rook d8 is played here, I have this move queen a1, and again, I don't have to rush with capturing on c7. In some lines, I'll have rook a8 as an option later, trading the rooks, and I basically kind of nullify the pressure on d4 without exchanging right away, which is what I wound up doing. So sometimes when you're in a rushed exchange, you kind of, some of the tension and the dynamism in the position goes away, which, clarifies black's defensive task, and that's what wound up happening here, because after the move knight a6, which I played right away, and then rook d8, I took on c7, and after queen takes c7, even though I'm a pawn up and this position is very nearly winning and it looks extremely promising, it's actually not an easy conversion because, again, this d4 pawn is kind of tricky to defend. There's always ideas of knight takes d4 and e5, exploiting a pin on the queen on d1. And if I play a move like c5, which seems like a nice thing to do to give myself a protected passed pawn, black can always maneuver the knight to d5 and try to blockade on the light squares, and it's extremely difficult to break that type of blockade. And so this is kind of the thing I was dealing with, and it's just not a very easy conversion. I played the move queen g4, just ducking out of the way of the d file and still keeping an eye on the d4 pawn. I thought this was a good move. And here, black played knight a5, which actually turns out to be a losing move if I'm able to take advantage of it. And unfortunately, here I did not find the correct way forward. Now, you see my pawn is attacked twice, so it seems extremely logical to defend that pawn by pushing it. And this was move 38, and I think in this tournament there was extra time at move 40. There was an extra 15 minutes, I think, at move 40, which is a little bit unusual, but it is extra time. And we were kind of low on time, so I wanted to just make the time control. But after this move c5, which I wound up playing, it actually gives black an opportunity to try and still blockade on these light squares. Instead, the move that wins and is actually quite unusual is actually the move bishop f4. And the point is that obviously the knight can't take on c4 because the queen is attacked, but the queen can't actually take on c4 either because it's actually still guarding this knight on a5. And basically because of that, remarkably, the position is just lost because there's actually only one way this queen can actually still stay connected to the knight, and it's actually queen b6. Note that if queen a7 is played, that actually runs into bishop d2, and all of a sudden this pin on the a file is decisive. And for instance, let's say queen takes d4, I can just take on d4 and then take on a5. But if rook takes d4, I actually can play rook takes a5, and the point is that if rook takes g4, I have rook takes a7, and I'm just a piece up. So that would be winning as well. And so really the only move is queen b6, and now here the move c5 is just decisive. And remarkably, the problem here is that I'm just a little bit too fast for black to even begin to set up a blockade. And, I can play bishop d6. I can reposition my queen to support the c-pawn. And the knight is not remotely close to that d5 square, which was the money square for black to defend. So c5 would be decisive. And if black tries to play queen b4, I have the move bishop c7, which, effectively skewers the rook on d8 and the knight on a5. And if you play rook takes d4, I have the move queen f3. And even though I gave up one of my pawns, this knight on a5 is nearly trapped. And if you move it off of the a file, I have rook a8 check and queen takes f7. And all of a sudden, I actually have a decisive attack on the king on g8. And so just to illustrate, if knight b3, rook a8 check, king h7, queen takes, there is a check on d1, king h2, and it's just over because if you go for knight d2, which does entertain knight f1 check, I have queen g8, king h6, another check, king g5, and then the simplest way is actually, I believe, h4 check. Point is that if you trade on h4, I now can go rook a4, king h5, and c6. And unfortunately for black, this pawn is just too much to handle. And if you go for a move like rook c1, I have bishop f4. I'm just in the nick of time attacking this knight on d2 and also introducing c7, where the pawn would be supported again. Again, this is a long line to go through and definitely difficult to see from far away. So maybe I shouldn't, beat myself up too much over it. But essentially, I would have played bishop f4 if I'd realized that neither piece could take on c4. And quite frankly, it is kind of just a one-move idea, because once you see that the queen and the knight can't take on c4, you also recognize that it's going to be very difficult for this knight to get back to d5 and blockade. So that's why this would have been way better. Instead, after c5, Black now played knight c6 and just heads towards that d5 square. I now decided to kind of go for it because I was a little bit panicked, I must say, that this position would be, very, very easily drawn, or not easily drawn, but the blockade would be very difficult to break and pretty much not possible. And so I tried to rush matters here in a position where I'm actually still winning with methodical play. And the best move in this position to try and, play methodically would be queen e4. The point is that I stay connected to the d4 pawn, and then I introduce the rook in the game to try and break the blockade. And so if you go for a move like queen d7, I now play the move rook a6. And the point is that I'm attacking this knight on c6, and the d4 pawn is actually immune, because if you play knight takes d4, I believe there's rook d6. And this nuance essentially is just winning, because you can throw in a spite check on e2, but after king f1, Black is going to lose a piece because the queen has to stay connected to the rook on d8. And so queen e4 would have been a decisive maneuver connected with rook a6, and it wouldn't have been winning right away, but it would have been kind of slowly winning. And I think one of the other key points is that if you play knight e7, now trying to reroute that knight to d5, I have the move bishop g5. And the point is that I'm actually going to trade my bishop for the knight and slowly advance my c-pawn, which is a protected pass pawn. And in the long run, Black can't really hold the heavy piece ending. Note that f6, trying to avoid the trade of bishop for knight, is impossible because it just hangs the e6 pawn. And, 2 pawns up, connected would be winning, even if the knight somehow manages to blockade. So let's say f6 takes, king h7, bishop e3, knight d5. Okay, Black has this blockade on the d5 square, but being 2 pawns down, it's just hopeless. There's no way that this position is a draw. So because of that, really queen e4 is the smart move, and it just would have forced me to be a little bit more methodical and patient, and I kind of thought that I was losing my grip on the position, so I didn't want to be patient. And instead, I tried to find a really forcing line. Unfortunately for me, being a little bit down on time and trying to make the control, I probably should have just waited till I got that extra time and then kind of made sure that my calculation was exactly right, because here I kind of rushed into something I wasn't completely sure of, and it was the move bishop g5. And bishop g5, on the face of it, looks extremely dangerous, because essentially the plan was to discourage this knight from going to e7 because I could exchange. And I also thought that, if the rook steps up to d7, I have rook a8 check, which would just be really dangerous, because I thought that I might actually have some mating ideas connected with the queen coming to h4 with mate. And so I really thought this rook had to stay on the 8th rank, and I thought that this position was probably, very close to winning, if not winning. Now, what I'd kind of overlooked was that after the move rook takes d4, which was played, and now we actually wound up making the control, that after rook a8 check, that this position is actually holding for Black. And I thought I was winning here because I'd calculated that after king h7, which was played, note that you can't block because the rook is hanging on d4, and you can't block with the knight because the rook is still hanging, and you can't block with the rook because I could take with the bishop and win the exchange. I thought this position was just lost because the king was coming to h7. And the point was that after king h7, I have this move f4, and all of a sudden, it seems like queen h4 check is just an unstoppable threat, and it's actually mate. And note that, black actually doesn't have any checks to even, get counterplay. But remarkably here, there's a move that I missed from far away, which holds everything together. Why don't you pause the video here and try to figure out the only move in the position that holds the position for black. All right, hopefully you got a chance to pause the video and try to work out this only move. It's not very difficult, actually, once you get to this position and see it, but from a few moves back, I just kind of underestimated this idea. The only thing I was looking at before we got here was knight d8, and I recognized that this was just losing because I could take on d8 and then just pick up the rook with queen h4 check, and it's actually still going to be mate because I'm going to recapture on d8 with the rook. But once I got to this position, I'd realized that Irina has the move knight b8. And this was kind of like a cold shower for me because all of a sudden, queen h4 isn't mate. And quite frankly, I have no way to add pressure to the b8 knight. So, if I play this check, black does walk into a pin, but I can't add any more pressure to the pin. Now, the sad reality of this position is because I gave up my d4 pawn and kind of went for it, now the c5 pawn is also weak, and I played the move f4, which also weakens my king side and also the second rank. So all of a sudden, I actually have to be quite careful not to lose the position because if I'm not, mating here, I've made a ton of weaknesses. And so much to my disappointment, now the material is equal, and I'm kind of just trying to find a way to not, screw up the game further because I recognized here there was no win. So I played the move queen h4 check still because at least now after king g8, black is actually walking into a pin, but there's just no brilliant follow-up here. And much to my dismay, I was like, oh man, maybe even queen takes c5 becomes an option because if I try to get cute with it, there's some ideas with rook d1 check and queen takes c5 at some point, and there could be some dangers for my king. And so here, I had to be quite careful, and I played the move bishop e7, and this move is a really precise one. It's actually the best move in the position, and it holds a draw, but unfortunately no more than that. The idea is that I defend the c5 pawn, and I also threaten bishop d6, and because of that, the black queen has to challenge this rook on a8, and she did so by playing the move queen b7. And the point is now my rook on a8 is challenged, and now if my rook moves away, this knight on b8 will be free to come to c6, and all of a sudden black might take over the initiative, so I have to be very, very careful here. And I'd seen queen b7 as an option and had seen a forced draw from here that I ultimately decided to take. And so I played the move bishop d6 relatively quickly. And the point is that now after queen takes a8, which was played, I actually have a perpetual with queen d8 check. And the game actually finished with a repetition here, and we agreed to a draw. Very, very interesting game, I thought, just from the standpoint that I basically played a black opening a tempo up. I didn't get any advantage out of the opening, but I understood the Carlsbad structure well enough to basically hold the equality for a long time. And then at some point, Irina erred in some time trouble, and I actually got a winning chance. So in a lot of chess games, what I'm finding is that it's really just the side that actually holds the equality longest that actually has the chance to actually win the game, and you don't actually have to do anything really special. You just have to kind of hold the fort a little bit, and I was able to hold the fort a little bit longer than Irina was. But unfortunately, when I got to a winning position, I didn't convert, and that's always a little bit disappointing. But I think all in all, a draw was a fair result, and I thought that if I played more games in this vein, where I played methodically and took my chances when they came, I would get chances in this event. So. A bit disappointing not to be on +1, but a draw doesn't kill you. So, I would just have to move on from this one. Anyways, that's it for this video. Thanks for watching. Please like and or subscribe to the channel. And if you want to support the Road to Grandmaster journey, you could do so by making a donation through the PayPal link in the description below. Thanks again. Take care.